Sutra of Relations, the Law of War. The best fight is the one not started. When starting a war, prepare 2 graves. Any conflict causes damage to both sides. There is a clear distinction between cunning and wisdom. The cunning person always tries to create a win-lose situation, where only they win while everyone else loses. However, a wise person creates a win-win situation, as it is harmonious, there are no losers, and no need for retaliation. But wise people are rare. Perhaps that's why, in the history of humanity, there have been over 15,000 documented wars. The war of all against all, bellum omnium contra omnes, as Thomas Hobbes once said, implying that this is the natural state of humans, while peace is merely a brief pause between wars. In many traditional societies, there was a desire to avoid the inevitable calamities of war while achieving the desired result. For example, China's military experience was preserved and summarized in Sun Tzu's treatise The Art of War, which stated that war is a grave matter for the state, the ground of life and death, the path of survival and destruction. According to Sun Tzu, victory is not achieved by battle. The best fight is the one that is never fought, as he said. According to the rules of warfare, the best thing is to keep the enemy's state intact, second best is to destroy it. The best is to keep the enemy's army intact, second best is to destroy it. Thus, to fight and win 100 battles is not the best of the best of the best is to conquer the enemy's army without fighting. This can only be done through skillful calculation, studying the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy. The best strategy is to thwart the enemy's plans, the next best is to break his alliances, the next is to attack his troops. In Sun Tzu's view, it is always better to be prepared for a possible attack and thereby make it unacceptable for the enemy. The rule of warfare is not to rely on the enemy not coming, but to rely on what I can do to meet him, not to rely on the enemy not attacking, but to rely on making it impossible for him to attack me. But the Chinese were not the only ones to use such tactics. When the Persian king Darius I, seeking glory through conquest, sent his army into Scythia, the Scythians did not accept his invitation to open battle, retreating further into the endless steppe and ultimately prevailing. Darius, unable to confront the enemy, was forced to abandon his plans of conquest, and the retreat of his forces marked his actual defeat. To fight like the Scythians meant to avoid direct confrontation as much as possible, wearing down the enemy, applying psychological pressure, and thus preparing for future victory. Roman history also confirms the effectiveness of this military strategy. When Hannibal brought his formidable forces to Italy, the Romans lacked the courage to stop him. The first battles revealed Carthage's superiority in almost every aspect. The agile African cavalry disrupted the ranks of the Roman legions, while the elephants, a kind of ancient heavy armor, struck terror into even seasoned soldiers, and any battle could prove decisive. The rash actions of Gaius Flaminius, who engaged in battle at Lake Trasimene, ended in a disaster for Rome. The flower of its legions, the best parts of its army, could not withstand Hannibal's onslaught and almost all perished. It was then that the Roman people appointed a dictator. In Republican Rome, the dictator was an official position, although extraordinary. The role went to Quintus Fabius Maximus, later nicknamed Cunctator, the delayer, a title he earned. Understanding that the best fight is the one not started, he focused on exhausting the enemy's forces. He allowed Hannibal to spread his troops across Italy while he slowly retreated, avoiding battle, preserving his army, and training inexperienced recruits gathered in haste. Any aggression is a grand advance on your own rake. Leonid Sukhorokov. Much fighting leads to great losses. Quintus Fabius's delay tactics bore fruit. During his 6-month dictatorship, not only was the Roman army preserved, but the groundwork for future victories was laid. It marked a significant military and political defeat for Hannibal and a turning point in what had begun as a highly successful war for Carthage. The Second Punic War ended in a decisive Roman victory, a triumph significantly credited to Quintus Fabius Maximus's calculated delay. This strategy of avoiding unnecessary conflicts is productive in any field. For example, animals that avoid direct confrontations typically gain an evolutionary advantage. Suppose a population contains two types of strategies: the hawk strategy, fighting to the death or until the opponent is wounded, even at the risk of injury to oneself, and the dove strategy, threats and displays of strength alongside avoiding serious conflict. When a hawk faces another hawk, both typically lose, since while there is a 50% chance of winning the encounter, there is also a 50% chance of losing. When a dove meets another dove, they threaten each other and win half of the contest without fighting. We find in the nature of man three principal causes of war: first, competition; second, mistrust; and third, the desire for glory. Thomas Hobbes. Every quarrel ends in peace. Aggression is inherent in the nature of living beings as one of the mechanisms of natural selection. The famous German biologist and philosopher Konrad Lorenz, a Nobel Prize laureate in physiology and medicine in 1973, argued that the basis of evolution is not interspecies struggle, as Charles Darwin's theory suggests, but intraspecies struggle. Representatives of the same species fight much more fiercely and uncompromisingly because they compete for identical resources necessary for survival, unlike other species that utilize different resources. For example, within their own community, rats display exemplary social virtues, but they become ruthless executioners when dealing with members of another rat community. This struggle does not serve spatial distribution or the selection of the strongest family defenders. From this biological law, Lorenz draws the conclusion about the inevitability of conflicts within human society. The harmful aggressiveness that remains like an evil inheritance in human blood today is the result of intraspecies selection that influenced our ancestors for tens of thousands of years throughout the Paleolithic. As soon as humans progressed to the point where, armed, clothed, and socially organized, they could somewhat limit external threats, hunger, cold, attacks from wild animals, harmful intraspecies selection immediately took over. From then on, the driving factor of selection became war. As humanity spread across the globe, it found itself in constant conflict with its neighbors. The reasons for these conflicts vary greatly, but the result is always the same: many people have died and continue to die, and as human civilization advances, the number of war casualties only increases. Remember, I am accustomed either to conquer or to remain on the battlefield. Napoleon I Bonaparte. A straw peace is better than an iron fight. Humanists of all ages have hoped that the global community would recognize the supreme value of human life and embrace an ethics of reverence for life. At the end of the Middle Ages, Erasmus of Rotterdam in his treatise The Complaint of Peace proclaimed that peace is a condition and even a source of human well-being, while war is the primary cause of all misfortunes and evils, a kind of ocean that swallows everything indiscriminately. Starting a war, as well as seeking revenge, according to Chinese wisdom, requires preparing two graves. As it is said, it is easy to start a war, but difficult to end it. The ironic Jean-Jacques Rousseau had little faith in this idea. In his view, it was too good to be accepted, for evil and abuses, beneficial to so many people, enter life by themselves, while what is useful to society can only be established through force, as private interests almost always oppose it. In his opinion, peace between nations can be established by relying on strength and defending national interests. Immanuel Kant believed that the great architect called nature would, through the course of historical development and the miseries of war, gradually lead people to the necessity of making peace the goal to which humanity is steadily approaching. This does not mean that humanity will definitely achieve this goal, however, we must act as if it will certainly be achieved. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel saw human history as a process of constant struggle between opposites, in which new qualities are created. Without this struggle, they would be impossible. Based on this, Hegel justified national wars. Philosophy, through Hegel, returns to the Romans with their formula, si vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Nevertheless, while wars may be inevitable in society or between states, they can certainly be avoided in relationships between individuals. The more private compromises there are, the less likely large-scale wars will occur. Diplomacy helps where people are ready to negotiate, preferring to achieve their goals through peaceful means. War has always been seen as the last resort, the ultima ratio, and wise, level-headed individuals resort to this argument only in the most extreme cases. One cannot expect any good from war. Virgil. With peace, there is space everywhere; with war, there is confinement everywhere. Open confrontation aimed at the complete destruction of the enemy, and even the sacralization of the act of killing, is often attributed to religious conflicts. However, the desire to mask mercantile interests with lofty ideals and justify wars of conquest as divine retribution has nothing to do with true faith. The militarized image of Islam that has become familiar over the past decade is generally rejected by Muslims themselves, who consider Islam a religion of peace, love, and justice. Jihad by the sword, or Ghazawat, the holy war of Muslims for the spread of Islam, is viewed as a last resort to bring non-believers to true worship. Peaceful means of preaching are preferred. If the enemy surrenders, the war is immediately ended. For a Muslim, war is undoubtedly a disaster, an extreme measure to be avoided whenever possible. Many Islamic scholars have denied the legitimacy of armed violence. For example, in the 19th century, Egyptian scholar Muhammad Abduh concluded that Islam should spread not through violence but through persuasion. The task of Muslims is to achieve social well-being based on religious morality, not to fight against non-believers. In the late 20th century, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Abd al-Aziz ibn Abdullah ibn Baz, also leaned toward avoiding military measures to solve problems. In response to a question from an ordinary Muslim about participating in jihad, the theologian wrote, "The greatest jihad for you will be taking care of your mother. Do not leave her and show her benevolence." The contemporary Muslim philosopher, Professor Said Hossein Nasr of Tehran University, urged his fellow believers to view jihad in the context of moral conflicts rather than fighting non-believers. Jihad is not merely the defense or expansion of Islamic borders, but a constant inner struggle against everything that obscures the truth from a person and disturbs his balance. Those who start wars fall into their own traps. John of Damascus. A bad peace is better than a good quarrel. Thus, Islam, like Christianity, shifts the main focus of human life from trying to reshape the world through violent re-education of others to internal self-improvement. War is a physical manifestation of humanity's hidden spiritual ailment, fratricidal hatred, the first example of which is seen in the story of Cain and Abel. After the innocent death of one brother, the other was cursed, and though not physically killed, his soul died. General 4:3-12. Jesus directly warned, all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Agree with your adversary quickly, while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Matt 5:25. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Rom 12:18. Christianity calls us not to seek unnecessary reasons for war but to strive for peace. If you find your enemy's ox or donkey wandering away, bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of your enemy fallen under its load, do not leave it there, release it. Exodus 23:4. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Matt 5:9. Strive for peace with all men, urges the Apostle Paul. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Rom 12:21. In the 13th rule of Basil the Great, 4th century, concerning warriors who shed blood in war, it is recommended that they undergo a penance, epidemia, with the 3-year excommunication from communion. This suggests that even in defensive war, killing remains a sin and inflicts a wound on the warrior's soul akin to that caused by death. Thus, we may speak of 2 graves, one for the deceased and the other, symbolic, for the one who did not die but mortally wounded his soul by taking a life. The Holy Fathers therefore call upon those who can prevent conflict to eliminate the causes of war, not the opponents, since wars constantly grow from the root of sin. The guardians of the law and strict observers of justice, by curbing the majority of sins, can also eliminate the causes of war. Although killing enemies in war seems legal and monuments are erected to victorious warriors, if we examine the close kinship between all men, this too is not innocent. Therefore Moses commanded that even one who killed in war must undergo purification and sprinkling. War turns people, born to be brothers, into wild beasts. Voltaire. Peace builds, war destroys. In the Buddhist text Dhammapada, there is this observation: victory breeds hatred, the defeated live in pain, the peaceful live happily, having renounced victory and defeat. In other words, any outcome of conflict is inherently negative, so it should not be initiated at all. In light of such principles, Buddhism may seem like an almost pacifist religion. However, in the Sutra The Lion's Roar of the World Sovereign, the Buddha addresses a ruler, saying, "You must ensure protection, security, and safety in your realm for the warriors in the army, for the nobles and vassals, for the Brahmins and lay people, for the city dwellers and villagers, for ascetics and priests, for animals and birds." Thus, the necessity of an army was not denied. In fact, it was seen as a tool for protecting the interests and citizens of a Buddhist state. Military service was not included in the list of unworthy livelihoods. It is no surprise then that in the East, in Japan, Thailand, etc., there arose communities of warrior monks who practiced Buddhism. These individuals actively participated in wars and even adorned their weapons with religious symbols, viewing their actions in the context of self-perfection. For instance, in the 20th century, a Thai warrior monk named Phra Ikes, when confronted by Americans who did not understand his position, tried to explain that he saw his mission as preventing social unrest and stopping people from offending others, even through the use of arms. As a result of a series of conflicts on various levels, by the middle of the last century, Buddhists concluded that in order to maintain the essence of their own religion, they must adhere to the following principles. War is a great swamp, easy to get into, but hard to escape. War is not an achievement. War is a disease. Like typhus. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. Non-aggression. Non-interference in internal affairs. Equality and mutual benefit. Peaceful coexistence. Thanks to these developments and the Buddhist philosophy of forgiveness, Buddhism solidified its commitment to a negative view of conflicts. In the tradition of Judaism, one of the primary advocates of peace was Rabbi Nachmanides, 1194–1270, widely known as Rambam. In his commentary on the Torah, he speaks of the moral inferiority of war, interpreting the commandment from Deuteronomy 23:9, "When you go out to camp against your enemies, beware of all that is evil." Scripture warns us to be especially careful during times of widespread sin. It is well known that when crowds go to war, they eat unclean foods, plunder, commit violence, and are not even ashamed to commit adultery and other abominations, so that even the most honorable of men becomes clothed in cruelty and malice when he goes to battle with the enemy. Therefore, Scripture warns, "Beware of all that is evil, for the Lord your God walks among your camp." The Spanish theologian Isaac Arama, c. 1420–1494, commenting on Deuteronomy 20:10, cites 3 reasons why one should attempt to make a peaceful agreement before resorting to war. A. One should follow the ways of the Lord, who does not desire the death of people or the destruction of the world but forgives the repentant. B. Peaceful conquest demonstrates the strength and magnanimity of the ruler. C. The outcome of war is at best uncertain, and at worst catastrophic. Unfortunately, these axioms are often overturned. But modern pacifist preachers continue to call for the rejection of wars and conflicts. The true task of pacifism today should not be so much to create a repulsive image of war, but to understand that only by knowing another beauty can we give up the one that war has always offered us. Creating another beauty may be the only path to true peace. We must show that we can illuminate the darkness of existence without resorting to the fire of war, and give things deep meaning without exposing them to the blinding light of death. We must learn to change our lives without taking life from others, circulate money and wealth without resorting to violence, find our ethical bearings without seeking them on the threshold of death, discover ourselves in familiar places and situations, not in trenches, experience the most incredible emotions without stimulating ourselves with the doping of war and the drug of small daily cruelties. We must create another beauty. This harmony and quiet strength, which holds opponents at a distance better than any aggression, is illustrated in the parable The Fighting Rooster. A ruler decided to acquire a fighting rooster and entrusted its training to a wise man living nearby. The ruler was eager to test his new fighter in cockfights, and after 10 days he asked the wise man, "Is the rooster ready for battle?" "Not yet. He walks arrogantly and flares up constantly," the wise man replied. After another 10 days, the ruler asked the same question. "Not yet," answered the wise man. "He still lunges at every shadow and every sound." After another 10 days, the king asked again. "Not yet." He looks angry and tries to show his strength. Peace and harmony are the greatest treasures. After 10 more days, the ruler asked the same question again. "Now he is ready," the wise man finally replied. Even if another rooster crows nearby, he remains unfazed. From a distance, he looks like he's carved from wood. His life force has reached completeness. Other roosters dare not challenge him. As soon as they see him, they flee. The best fight is the one that never happened. Every war, like a fire or disease, is easiest to prevent at the very beginning, before the spark turns into a flame. The reasons, or rather pretexts, for starting wars are always disproportionate to their devastating consequences. If only people knew how to stop in time, think, and not immediately rush into open confrontation, destroying on their way good neighborly relations, noble goals, and shared plans, the long-cherished dream of humanity would come true, when they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Isaiah 2:4.